Okay, so you want to build a data center. Not code one, not run one, just own the building. Concrete walls, diesel generators, chillers the size of shipping containers. The infrastructure everyone is calling the new oil. The pitch sounds almost too clean. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Meta, Oracle, and Apple are on track to spend roughly $700 billion this year alone on AI infrastructure. That is nearly 6 times what the same 6 companies spent back in 2022. Somewhere inside that number is a warehouse with your name on the deed, collecting rent from the richest companies on the planet, guaranteed for the next 15 years. That's the pitch. Here is the twist nobody puts on the brochure. In the first 3 months of this year, local opposition helped delay or cancel data center projects worth more than $130 billion across 49 states. Not a fringe complaint from a handful of towns. A coordinated, fast-growing backlash against the exact asset class every pension fund, REIT, and private equity shop on Earth is currently racing to buy into. And the backlash isn't slowing the money down. Lawmakers in more than 30 states introduced over 300 data center bills in the first quarter of this year alone. Congress even saw a proposed moratorium on new AI data centers. It went nowhere. The capital keeps arriving anyway. So before you pour a single yard of concrete, you need 3 answers. Who actually owns this business? Who actually gets paid first? And who is left holding the site when the deal falls apart? Here's the picture from the outside. A data center is basically a very secure warehouse. Rows of servers, humming under white light, guarded like a bank vault. From the outside, it looks like one business: build the box, plug in the cloud, collect the check. From the inside, it is at least 3 different businesses wearing one building. Layer 1, the landlord. Real estate investment trusts like Equinix and Digital Realty, the 2 largest data center REITs on the planet, acquire land, build the shell, wire in the power, and lease finished space to whoever needs it. Digital Realty alone operates more than 300 data centers across 50 cities. Their business model looks almost identical to a shopping mall operator. Build it, lease it, collect rent for decades. Layer 2, the operator. Companies like Vantage and QTS build and run the facility itself. Cooling systems, security, redundancy, either for their own account or under contract, often backed by private investment firms hungry for a piece of the boom. Layer 3, the tenant. This is where it gets interesting. The hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, are not just tenants anymore. Increasingly, they are becoming their own landlords. Microsoft alone earmarked 3,200 acres in Cheyenne, Wyoming, purely for its own data center campuses. Meta is doing the same thing, building its own facilities while simultaneously leasing space from everyone else, just to move faster than construction alone allows. The consolidation is happening at the ownership level too. Blackstone filed for a $1.75 billion data center REIT of its own. Blue Owl Capital moved to acquire Sila Realty Trust, a REIT focused on critical infrastructure, for $2.4 billion. Ares took the REIT Whitestone private in a $1.7 billion deal. Traditional real estate money is rebuilding itself in real time into vehicles built specifically for this one asset class. So when you ask, who owns the data center industry? The honest answer is, it depends which layer you're standing on. The landlord earns steady rent. The operator earns a thinner margin for taking on operational risk. And the tenant, the hyperscaler, increasingly wants to own the whole stack itself, because leasing from someone else means sharing the upside of the most valuable asset class in the world. And the scale involved makes the fight over ownership worth having. Analysts project roughly 100 gigawatts of new data center capacity coming online globally between now and 2030. Hyperscale, co-location, and on-premise combined. That translates to an estimated $1.2 trillion in new real estate asset value. On top of another $1 to $2 trillion tenants will spend fitting that space out with actual computers. Vacancy across the industry currently sits near a record low 2%. There is, quite simply, nowhere near enough finished space for the demand that already exists. That tension, landlord versus tenant, rent versus ownership, is the entire plot of this episode. Let's say you actually want in. Here is the order the costs arrive, and it is not what most people assume. Step 1 isn't land. It's power. Developers now search specifically for what the industry calls powered land, a site with an existing substation and confirmed grid capacity, before they even look at soil or zoning. Speed to power is the single biggest factor in site selection today, ahead of tax breaks, ahead of proximity to customers, ahead of almost everything else. Land without megawatts attached to it is just a field. A whole new middleman business has grown out of exactly this bottleneck. CBRE calls it the powered land model. An investor buys raw acreage, spends years completing entitlements and securing a confirmed power connection, then sells the shovel-ready site to a developer at a markup, without ever laying a single brick and without ever running a single server themselves. In Florida, brokers now say it plainly. The constraint isn't land, and it isn't money. It's the wait for gas turbines to be manufactured and installed, and for the local utility to physically build the substations a project needs before it can draw a single watt. Step 2 is construction. JLL's 2026 forecast puts the average cost of building just the shell and core of a data center at $11.3 million per megawatt. That's before a single server goes in. Fitting the building out with the actual AI computing equipment, the GPUs, the racks, the cooling, can run tenants up to $25 million per megawatt on top of that. A midsize AI campus needs hundreds of megawatts. Do that math, and you're well into the billions before a single query gets processed. Step 3. The power queue itself has become the real bottleneck. Utilities are being asked for hundreds of megawatts per project, sometimes gigawatts, the output of a small nuclear plant, and grid interconnection now takes years, not months. In parts of Florida, developers say the constraint isn't land or money anymore. It's waiting in line for gas turbines to be manufactured and installed. Then there's the price of electricity itself. In the PJM grid, the power market covering 13 states from Chicago to Washington, D.C., capacity prices jumped from $28.92 per megawatt day to over $329 in just 2 auction cycles. Independent market monitors attribute 63% of that spike directly to data center demand. $269 per megawatt day. That's what one recent PJM auction cleared at, a number that barely existed at this scale 3 years ago, and one that every resident on that grid is now paying for on their monthly bill, whether they ever asked for a data center or not. Between 2021 and 2026, average residential electricity prices in Washington, D.C. rose 94%. In Maryland, 74%. In Maine, 73%. In New York, 58%. Data centers are not the only reason for those increases, but in the states carrying the heaviest data center load, they are consistently named as the single largest driver of new cost. One consumer advocacy estimate puts the coming hit at an extra $70 a month for the average household in the PJM region by 2028. Then comes water. A single hyperscale campus proposed in Texas was projected to need 5 million gallons of lake water a day by its 5th year of operation, in a county already dealing with drought. A separate project in California's Imperial Valley requested 750,000 gallons a day, drawn from the drought-stricken Colorado River, offset by taking nearby farmland out of production instead. Even the overflow costs money. Building a hyperscale campus now generates so much staging and logistics activity that Meta and Google have started leasing the warehouses next door just to store construction equipment and spare parts. A second-order real estate boom riding on top of the first one. And finally, the cost nobody puts in a spreadsheet, the community itself. Zoning fights, environmental review, lawsuits, entire local elections fought over one proposed building. Opposition groups tracking these projects nationally grew from fewer than 400 at the end of last year to more than 800 by the end of March. That number keeps climbing every quarter. So the building exists. Power is secured, cooling is installed. How does the money actually move? At the bottom, the REIT collects rent, long-term leases, often 10 to 15 years, with investment-grade tenants like Amazon or Microsoft. Stable, boring, bond-like income. 3 public REITs dominate this layer: Digital Realty, Equinix, and Iron Mountain, which converted part of its old paper storage business into data center space and now offers the highest dividend yield of the 3. Equinix adds a second layer on top: interconnection fees, charging companies for the privilege of physically cross-connecting their servers to other networks inside the very same building. It's a toll booth built into the middle of the internet, and it carries a higher margin than the real estate itself. To put the size of the tenant side in perspective, Amazon alone has committed roughly $200 billion to AI infrastructure build-out. That single number is larger than the entire market capitalization of Digital Realty and Equinix combined. The tenant, in other words, could functionally buy its landlord several times over, and increasingly, it would rather build than buy. The operator in the middle earns a thinner slice, service fees, power markup, management contracts, while carrying the operational risk of keeping thousands of servers cool and online 24 hours a day, every day, forever. One unplanned outage can cost a tenant more in penalty clauses than the operator makes in an entire month. But here's the number that actually explains who wins. Return on invested capital. Microsoft generates roughly 26%. Equinix generates around 9%. That gap, nearly 3 times over, is the entire reason hyperscalers increasingly want to own their own buildings instead of renting them. Think about it this way. The REIT takes on the enormous capital risk of construction, financing, permitting, and years of development timeline, and gets paid a steady, contractually capped rent for it. The hyperscaler takes that same physical infrastructure, fills it with AI models, sells access to the outside world at whatever price the market will bear, and keeps every dollar of the difference. The landlord gets rent. The tenant gets the upside. That's why nearly every hyperscaler now runs a dual strategy. Lease from REITs when speed matters most, and self-build when they can afford to wait, because self-building means keeping all of that 26% return instead of splitting it with a landlord who only earns 9%. There's also a shift coming in what tenants actually need space for. Training AI models drove most of the demand through 2025. By 2027, analysts expect inference, running the models once they're already built, to overtake training as the primary workload. That shift matters because inference is steadier, more distributed, and less concentrated in a handful of megacampuses, which could quietly change who needs to lease from whom. There's a second, quieter cash flow underneath all of this: debt. Building at gigawatt scale requires roughly $870 billion in new debt financing across the industry through 2030. REITs and infrastructure funds are leveraging up to compete for land and power contracts, essentially betting the entire capital structure on AI compute demand continuing to grow at its current pace for years without pause. And most REITs in this space depend on a remarkably small customer list. Often just 2 or 3 hyperscalers make up the bulk of their leased revenue. If demand ever slows, even slightly, the highly leveraged middle of this stack is where the cracks would show first. Not at the hyperscaler, who can absorb a slowdown across a much bigger balance sheet. At the landlord and the operator, who signed decade-long obligations assuming the boom never stops. Here is what it looks like when this business fails, not in theory, but in the last 6 months. Henderson County, Texas. A company called Diode Ventures proposed a data center campus next to Cedar Creek Reservoir, the lake that supplies water to part of the Fort Worth area. The build-out was projected to take 12 years. By year 5, it was expected to draw 5 million gallons of lake water a day. The site sat in the middle of a developed subdivision, hundreds of homes deep. A group called Save Cedar Creek Lake formed in early 2026. Just volunteers, no national backing. A federal lawsuit followed, tied to the watershed. The state's governor took a tougher public stance on rural data center siting. And in July 2026, Diode Ventures walked away, telling regulators only that the site did not align with infrastructure availability, community priorities, and long-term project viability. 12 years of planned construction. Gone, before ground was ever broken. New Brunswick, New Jersey. A 27,000 square foot lot was slated for a data center. After sustained protest from local residents and environmental groups, the city council didn't just deny the permit. They voted to build a public park on the exact site instead. A data center, replaced on paper by a playground, inside a single council meeting. Pacific, Missouri, in Franklin County. A company called Beltline Energy proposed a $16 billion data center project. The zoning meeting where residents planned to speak against it ended within minutes. Because the developer withdrew the rezoning request before public comment even began. $16 billion, canceled before the town even got to vote. It kept happening, city after city. Denver moved toward a moratorium to review zoning, energy, and water rules before approving anything new. Sangamon County, Illinois, narrowly rejected a moratorium on new approvals, voting it down 5-3. But state lawmakers are now debating pulling the tax credits instead, which could hit the economics just as hard without a single vote against a specific project. San Marcos, Texas, voted 5-2 against the rezoning a $1.5 billion project needed to proceed. Even in Texas, one of the most data center-friendly states in the country, a project can still die at the city council level the moment rezoning is required. And this isn't 3 or 4 isolated incidents. According to Data Center Watch, 75 projects worth more than $130 billion were delayed or canceled in just the first quarter of this year, across 49 states. The number of organized opposition groups more than doubled in 3 months, from roughly 400 to more than 800. It isn't only local politics, either. In one recent case, Amazon agreed to pay $20.5 million to settle claims tied to nitrate pollution connected to data center operations. A reminder that when the system fails, it doesn't always fail as a canceled proposal. Sometimes it fails after the concrete is already poured, as a lawsuit and a settlement check. Here's the pattern underneath every one of these stories. None of them failed because AI demand disappeared. None of them failed because the hyperscaler tenant walked away. They failed at the local level: water tables, zoning boards, county commissioners, volunteer coalitions with no institutional backing at all, standing between a multi-billion-dollar developer and one piece of land. The industry spent years treating land and power as the hard constraints. It turns out the hardest constraint of all might be a town meeting. In most episodes of this series, the answer to who wins is simple: whoever owns the brand and stays asset-light. Franchise out the risk, keep the fee. Data centers flip that pattern on its head. Here, the landlord, the REIT, the supposedly safe, asset-light player, is the one capped at a 9% return, locked into decade-long leases it cannot renegotiate even when demand spikes. Meanwhile, the tenant, Microsoft, at 26% return on invested capital, is the one taking on more physical risk by building its own facilities and getting paid handsomely for it. Even the tenants seem to know this contradiction can't last forever. That's exactly why Meta runs both strategies at once, building its own campuses for the long-term upside, while still leasing from developers wherever it needs capacity faster than it can build. Nobody in this industry is fully betting on one model. Everybody is hedging. The real winners are the parties closest to two things: uncommitted electricity and land that already has permission to use it. A utility sitting on spare generation capacity can sign a long-term power purchase agreement with a hyperscaler at a premium rate and lock in decades of guaranteed revenue, without building a single server rack. A landowner near an existing substation, with zoning already in place, can sell powered land for a fraction of total project cost and walk away long before a single opposition group even forms. Utilities sitting on carbon-free generation, hydro, nuclear, large-scale solar, are seeing unprecedented interest from data center developers willing to sign power purchase agreements at premium rates, locking in revenue for decades without adding a single new customer complaint to their books. That is, in effect, a risk-free lease on electricity itself. The losers are the parties standing in the middle without leverage over either one. The pure operator, competing on thin service margins. The REIT, contractually capped while its own tenants' returns run nearly 3 times higher. And increasingly, the ratepayer down the street, who never signed a lease with anyone, but is now paying an extra $70 a month because the regional grid decided data centers count as everyone's problem. Not because the REIT model is broken. Not because the hyperscalers did anything illegal. Because in an industry where the physical constraint, power, is scarcer than the capital chasing it, whoever controls that constraint keeps the leverage. Everyone else just signs the lease. So go back to the pitch from the start of this video. Own the building. Collect rent from the richest companies on Earth for 15 years, guaranteed. That pitch is still technically true. The lease is still there. The rent still gets paid, on time, every quarter, right up until the year the power contract runs out, or the water permit gets challenged, or the county commissioners hold a meeting you didn't even know was happening. The deed with your name on it was never the real risk in this business. The town meeting was. Every data center now under construction sits at the intersection of two things nobody fully controls: how much electricity a town is willing to sell, and how much a community is willing to tolerate, for a return it will never personally see. $700 billion a year, says the industry, is betting that tension resolves in its favor, everywhere, indefinitely. $130 billion in canceled projects, in 3 months, says otherwise. So here are the two questions this industry still hasn't answered. Are you betting on the AI boom itself? Or are you betting on a town's patience outlasting its own drought, its own power bill, and its own upcoming election? And if the answer changes depending on which zip code you build in, is this really one business? Or is it 50 different bets, all wearing the exact same pitch deck?